want to thank you. We can't just talk to ourselves. I want to thank all of you for coming here and participating in this conference. Dostlarım, meslektaşlar, yoldaşlarım. I want to thank lots of people. I want to thank Mira Ursal. I want to thank Ayatin Sen, who have been so generous in supporting this conference. I want to thank one more, and I want to thank the organising committee, led by Kemal Inal and supported by so many people that I can see sitting in front of me. So thank you for organising this wonderful conference. This is the third of the international conferences on critical education. They were preceded by a number of conferences in Greece, organised by Kostas Skordoulis. Where is Kostas? Here. Kostas is in the front. Now the conferences are organised by a triumvirate. Kostas Skordoulis, Kemal Inal, and me. And we will continue, and we will continue, and we will get bigger, because the struggles will get bigger, the necessity for resistance and solidarity will get bigger, and we will see you here repeatedly in bigger and bigger numbers. Because in bigger numbers, we are stronger. We're also stronger when we engage in critical debate. Now, what we do, we believe in bringing people together. We believe in diversity. I am a revolutionary Marxist. There are many people here who are radical anti-racists, radical anti-sexists. We are here from a variety of different traditions. And that is fantastic. We bring each other we bring together colleagues and comrades from different traditions, but through debate we sharpen our understanding. And among friends, and we are among friends, we critique, and we look forward to receiving your critique, and we look forward to everybody participating in critique of all the people who are going to give papers. One thing that cost us, I'm going to speak for another 4 minutes, not another 40. One thing that Kostas and I and Kemal have decided is that this conference is called not critical pedagogy, it is called critical education, of which critical pedagogy is a part, an important part. But critical education goes wider. It also goes more internationally, because critical pedagogy seems to be very important, potentially very liberating, but it seems to be mainly Latin America, North America, and a few in different countries. And we applaud the growth of critical pedagogy. But one thing we are aware of is the dominance, the colonialist dominance, of what we can call Banan, Britain, North America, Australasia. That is a problem on the international critical left. The domination by the English language. Which is why we hold the conference in Greece, in Turkey, who knows where next year. Because we know that critical educators, Marxist educators, revolutionary educators, socialist educators. We are millions throughout the world. We are not just a few people sitting in universities. All of you in this room, everybody in this room is a radical educator, is a critical educator. And so the purpose of this conference is to bring together critical pedagogues from the different traditions, critical educators from the different traditions, and together we can learn and we can go out and we can learn again. I'll end up this introduction, I'm introducing the conference, I'll end up this introduction by saying a few obvious things. I'm going to show you some photos. Actually, I can't, because I can't get my internet to work. But in Istanbul, one example, in Istanbul, I was with Cezanne. Where is Cezanne? I was with Cezanne and some other comrades from Eğitim Sen. Stand up, Cezanne. And Cezanne and her comrades, Mariam and Ozden. Is Ozden here? 38 people called Ozden stood up. They were hosting me when I was in Istanbul. And I saw the face of soft fascism. I saw the face of Islamo-conservatism. I saw the face of those who protect neoliberalism. I saw the face of those who are privatising, commodifying, consumerising schools and universities. And the face was 400 police with their tear gas masks on. But Turkey's not alone. Kostas and I have been tear gassed together in Syntagma Square in Greece, in Athens. We have been chased by the police in Ireland, in England. This is a global assault. It's an international assault. And so my final sentence is that capital is international, neoliberalism is international, neoconservatism is international, the growth of soft fascism and in some countries Nazism is international as well. So how do we contest? We contest, comrades, with international solidarity of the working class. Solidarity! And now, finally, I want to introduce Peter McLaren. But I'll say a few things about Peter. Peter performs a very valuable service to the international, to the global resistance against capitalism and against neoliberalism. Peter McLaren, for those of you who don't know, has written or edited around 50 books. One of his books, Life in Schools, was voted by the Moscow Academy of Sciences as one of the 10 most influential education books of the 20th century. He writes from his heart, he writes from his brain, and he's an inspiration. Peter McLaren, I invite you to come and speak.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Thank you, Dave, for that introduction and for the opening remarks. Mal, thank you. Dave, thank you. Kostas, thank you. It's good to see everyone here. Good to see Rabbi and others. And it's great to be back in Turkey. This is my second time in Turkey, and I hope to be able to come back many, many, many more times. Thank you to Ankara University and to all those who made it possible for me to be here at the conference. Now, I'm not easy to translate, and I get into a little rhythm when I talk and I read, so I hope that I'm not going to be reading too quickly for the translators. And if I am, perhaps you could just signal me with your hand to slow down a little bit. But I don't want to go over an hour, and I've got a lot of materials that I want to share with you. So I've come with a prepared text, and I'd like to start now. The tectonic plates of history are shifting, rumbling through the fathomless fissures of time and exploding to the surface are humanity's raw bone cries of enough. In Espanol es ya basta. After generations of abuse as nature's free gift to capital, Mother Earth is dying. Her death throes reverberating across the seas. Shining through their own effulgence, her pyroclastic tears light up the evening sky, spewed from rotting smokestacks in what were once pristine fields, yielding bumper crops under a harvest moon. The world's slums no longer pockmark the planet, but define its central features. Everything, including the tears of the poor, are up for sale. If at any time a militant pedagogy of empowered citizenry is needed, it is now. To create a pedagogy that is up to the task of challenging the neoliberal behemoth that now bestrides the world, urinating its wastewater sewage over crumbling metropolises like a fracking colossus in overalls in a miner's hat who's had too much beer. Conditions of possibility for an alternative to neoliberal capitalism must first be created. We call this alternative after the Bolivarian revolutionaries of Venezuela, a socialism for the 21st century. But the word socialism, let alone revolutionary-style socialism, given birth by the movement of the Fifth Republic, the Movimiento de la Quinta República, established to support the presidential candidacy of Hugo Chavez in 1998, has taken a defensive posture in an age in which the social democracy is on the decline in the European Union, and where in the United States, socialism is defined in the corporate media as if it were synonymous with the ex-Soviet Union or the Eastern Bloc police states. We live in the Golgotha of the planet, in which the global coloniality between Europeans and Euro-Europeans is increasingly organized in a hierarchical division of labor that is nothing less than a massive form of global apartheid. Not only do we need a pedagogy that does not avert attention from contemplating problems of social, political, and cultural domination, and does not obfuscate its own complicity with the coloniality of power. We need a mass struggle determined by our collective engagement with the world economy as it participates in the natural world. This will surely require new forms of radical subjectivity and radical agency. And it is to the task of building those new social forms of political and pedagogical agency that revolutionary critical eco-pedagogy must dedicate itself. Noam Chomsky pitches the challenge as follows. And he says, in future, historians, if there are any, will look back on this curious spectacle taking place in the early 21st century. For the first time in human history, humans are facing the significant prospect of severe calamity as a result of their actions. Actions that are battling our prospects of decent survival. Those historians will observe that the richest and most powerful country in history, we're talking about Estados Unidos, United States, which enjoys incomparable advantages, is leading the effort to intensify the likely disaster, leading the effort to preserve conditions in which our immediate descendants might have a decent life. The so-called primitive society, First Nations, tribal, indigenous, aboriginal, the countries with large and influential indigenous populations are well in the lead in seeking to preserve the planet. The countries that have driven indigenous populations to extinction or extreme marginalization are racing towards destruction. By the way, I just should say, somewhat extemporaneously, that I was in Mexico a few years ago. I was in Mexico just last week in DF, in Mexico City. But a few years ago, I was in Mexico and I was introduced to an indigenous group that had decided that it was going to make itself extinct. They said, we're not going to have any more children. We're not going to reproduce anymore because we can't stand the thought of living the kind of lives we're living here in Mexico any longer. So this group has consciously determined to make itself extinct, to commit suicide. Ecuador, with its large indigenous population, is seeking aid from the rich countries to allow it to keep its substantial oil reserves underground, where they should be. Meanwhile, the US and Canada are seeking to burn fossil fuels, including the extremely dangerous Canadian tar sands, and to do so as quickly and fully as possible, while they hail the wonders of a century, largely meaningless, energy to independence without a side glance as to what the world might look like after this extravagant commitment to self-destruction. This observation generalizes. Throughout the world, indigenous societies are struggling to protect what they sometimes call the rights of nature, while the so-called civilized and sophisticated scoff at this silliness. Under austerity or immiseration capitalism, Europe is witnessing its deepest economic and social crisis since the Second World War. In 2012, more people lost their jobs than in any other year in the last 2 decades. The situation, of course, we know is particularly severe in southern and eastern European countries. For example, in Greece and Spain, 1 person in 4 is officially unemployed, with over half of young people without work. As Peter Schwartz puts it, quote, despite the social catastrophe they have provided with their austerity policies, European governments are intent on tightening the fiscal screws. They are no longer limiting themselves to the periphery of the Eurozone, but are ever more ferociously attacking the working class in the core countries. End of quote. Thus, new draconian plans are afoot for Italy, France, and Germany, while in the UK, with almost a quarter living in poverty, the condemned government is systematically attempting to undermine the welfare state, to destroy the National Health Service, social welfare, and state education. As Prime Minister David Cameron said of education, here's his quotation, in welfare reform, we've been radical. In education, almost revolutionary, busting open the state monopoly of education and allowing new free schools to start up, and crucially, to compete in this global race. And that was from the official site of the British Prime Minister's office, 2013. In the United States, of course, the situation is spectacularly grim. The US economy has not managed to climb back from its pre-recession level of unemployment. Far from it. Nearly 14 million Americans currently are jobless, and things look to be getting worse before they get better, assuming they do get better, and I doubt if they ever will get better, in what is increasingly becoming an era of downward mobility for 99% of Americans, and a new gilded age for the 1% who constitute this financial aristocracy. There's just one job available for every 5 individuals looking for work. Those finding jobs are finding pretty lousy jobs, often part-time and with fewer and fewer benefits. But it's appreciably different for those at the top. The richest 10% of Americans received an unconscionable 100% of the average income growth in the years 2000 to 2007. You'd think that this would have driven most people in US cities into the streets, howling like a naked Allen Ginsberg with his angel-headed hipsters. But it did not, although it certainly did contribute to the rise of the Occupy Wall Street movement. In 2009, the richest 5% claims 63.5% of the nation's wealth, and the bottom 80% collectively held just 12.8%. The unprecedented combination of mass unemployment, falling wages, and an influx of free money from the Federal Reserve has led to a record-setting surge in corporate profits. Corporations are flush with capital, but are just sitting on it, preferring at this time not to invest their vast windfalls in jobs. Instead of investing in production, major corporations whose coffers are overflowing and whose stocks are hitting record levels are paying out dividends and inflating their own stock values. CEOs are cashing in on stocks that are soaring in value with the rising market, with a growing number of CEOs reaping individual profits of $50 million each or more. Well, as capital moves freely, investing in production or in fictitious forms of capitalism, and as speculators, financier capitalists, stock and bond traders, investment bankers, hedge fund managers, and others help to unleash the forces of capital accumulation globally. And as neoliberalism, with its aggressive pro-market state policies, allows this finance capital to restructure itself, to diversify its forms, to expand its accumulation opportunities through the growth of retail, financial, and service industries, and to enhance its global reach, then it's safe to assume that the entire ecosystems of the planet have been harnessed exploitatively in a system of capitalist commodity production, so that we can't really talk about capitalism at all today without talking about capitalism as a world ecology. Capitalism is a world ecology. The whole physiognomy of capital has changed, with finance capital requiring a parallel accumulation of political power, with financiers married to an unchecked political oligarchy, spawning highly parasitic, financialized forms of capitalism, such as asset stripping. The vampire of capitalism has grown a second set of fangs. The long shadow of Nosferatu falls across a systematic and ongoing attack on the living standards of the vast majority of the world's population. Well, this begs the question: is there a viable alternative to neoliberal capitalism? Well, in 1998, President Hugo Chavez won the presidential elections in Venezuela by a landslide. Chavez stressed the importance of development from below, which could be achieved through the democratization of the workplace by way of workers' councils and a major shift of ownership of production, trade, and credit in order to expand food production and basic necessities to the poor who inhabit the internal market. And it's really interesting that Chavez, at least at one point early on, was a fan of Tony Blair's Third Way. Very briefly, believe it or not. But he quickly apologized and realized the errors of his way. Once President Chavez was able to control the oil industry, his government was able to reduce poverty by half and reduce extreme poverty by 70%. Public pensions rose from 500,000 to over 2 million. Chavez helped turn Venezuela from being one of the most unequal countries in Latin America after Cuba to being the most equal in terms of income. Under the naked thrall of neoliberal capitalism, the United States has become one of the most unequal countries in the world, by contrast. Capitalism works through a process of exchange value, whereas Chavez was more interested in the process of communal exchange. That is, to cite but one example, exchanging oil for medical care in a program with Cuba, in which Cuban doctors were brought into Venezuela and were set up all throughout the barrios, throughout the country. Chavez followed the principle of buen vivir, which can be translated as to live well. But this term, which has indigenous roots, is very different from the North American term, the good life. Buen vivir requires that individuals in their various communities are in actual possession of their rights and are able to exercise their responsibilities in the context of a respect for diversity and in accordance with the rights of ecosystems. It's interesting. You know, in the United States, in Estados Unidos now, which is las entrañas de la bestia, right, which is the belly of the beef, they've given corporations the rights that they've given human beings. Corporation in the United States is defined as a human being. Whereas in Venezuela, they prefer to give those rights to ecosystems. Quite a contrast. So it's about social wealth, not material wealth. I was privileged to be a guest several times on President Chavez's TV show called A lo Presidente. Once when sitting next to Ernesto Cardenal. As many of you, I'm sure, realize Ernesto Cardenal was the Minister of Culture for the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. I listened to Ernesto talk eloquently about Chavez and Chavez's dream of bringing humanity together through a deep spiritual love. I attended meetings of the Misiones, social programs in health, education, work, and housing set up by Chavez. You know, it's really interesting, if I could be extemporaneous. There have been some major studies done on adult literacy where they've tried to examine, they've given tests in adult literacy actually to young people from countries that are considered the most equal in terms of income distribution, which would be Finland, say, and Sweden. Comparing those with young people that come from countries like the United States, which are among the most unequal in the world. And they factored, and they factored in for parents' level of education. If you take children whose parents have high school education in Finland and students whose parents have high school education in the United States, the children from the more equal countries fare much better. Now, Sweden would have as much poverty as the United States were it not for its social programs. That's what makes the difference. Okay? So, when Chavez came to office in 1999 to help the poor to become literate, to finish high school, to organize their communities, and to get medical attention. Misiones involved citizen and worker-managed governance and helped dramatically reduce poverty throughout all of Venezuela. These initiatives spanned education. We had Mission Robinson, Mission Rivas, Mission Sucre in education. For the environment, we had Mission Energía. For food and nutrition, we had Mission Mercado. For science, we had Mission Ciencia. For socioeconomic transformation, we had Misión Vuelven Caras. For healthcare, we had Misión Barrio Adentro. For housing, we had Misión Habitat. For indigenous rights, we had Misión Guaquiapuro. For land reform, Misión Zamora. For rural development, we had Misión Vuelva al Campo and Misión Arbo. For identity rights, we had Misión Identidad. And for the civilian militia, we had Misión Miranda. And for culture, we had Misión Corazón Adentro. All of these missions were set up by the Chavez government throughout Venezuela. In 2005, when President Chavez offered residents of the Bronx in New York a new type of program to heat their homes, it was ridiculed in the US newspapers as a cheap publicity stunt. Chavez was using the profits from his nation's rich oil reserves to enact social spending programs, and was offering residents of the Bronx in New York, in the United States, the same deal, which meant he would provide heating oil to economically disadvantaged residents at a major discount through Citgo, his organization called Citgo, provided that the savings that were made were reinvested into programs that benefited the poor. Veteran Congressman Jose Serrano in the Bronx has since voiced praise for Chavez for instituting this program in his district of the Bronx, New York. Now contrast that with Pat Robertson, a major evangelist, a Christian evangelist in the United States with his own television program, who publicly called for the assassination of Hugo Chavez on his TV show, which is watched by millions and millions and millions of US citizens. He called for the assassination of Hugo Chavez. In 2006, when I was denounced by a right-wing organization as UCLA's most dangerous professor, and the organization offered to pay students $100 to secretly audio tape my classes, or $50 to produce notes from my lectures, it was the Chavistas who first rallied to support me at the World Educational Forum in Caracas. They were the first to stand up and to denounce these neo-McCarthyite tactics being used against me at UCLA, and I'll never forget their solidarity. Now, since more than 70% of university students come from the wealthiest quintile of the population, Chavez instituted what he called the Bolivarian university system, in which the students themselves were able to participate in the management of their own institution. Education was designed to promote citizen participation and joint responsibility, and to include all citizens in the creation of a new model of production that stressed endogenous development, that is, an economic system that was self-sufficient and that was diversified. Misiones were created to create a social economy and a diversity of production and designed to meet the needs of Venezuela's poor and to counteract Venezuela's oil dependency. Higher education was deconcentrated. This is really interesting. Deconcentrated from the urban centers in order to assist the rural communities. I remember how much I enjoyed teaching at the Bolivarian University. I got to go back there in October. And it's located next to Universidad Central, which is the university mostly for the children of the ruling class. And I remember being invited to give a talk there. And I remember the first words I said, and it was kind of like a setting like this, you know, like a relatively formal setting. And they had a big mural that the students made of critical theorists. And I was fortunate to be included on the mural. But my first words in my talk were, "Soy Chavista," right? I'm a Chavista. And when I left, apparently the students ran up to the mural and ripped my image off the wall. It's interesting. I'll never forget that. College enrollment doubled under Chavez. Student projects were insolubly linked to community improvement. And at a graduation ceremony in the early years of the Bolivarian University, Chavez famously said this. He was at the graduation, and he said, "Capitalism is machista, and to a large extent excludes women. That's why, with the new socialism, girls, you can fly free." Chavez set up a structure, this is really fascinating. Chavez set up a structure to offer employment for the graduates of the Bolivarian University through a presidential commission that enabled new graduates to be placed around the country in development projects, so that the graduates would receive a scholarship that was slightly above the minimum wage. Some of these projects involved Mission Arbol, or the tree mission, recovering the environment damaged by capitalism. Yes. And so basically what Chavez did was, if you were, for instance, if you graduated in physics, they would find a job for you. You would actually get funded to go and work in perhaps an electronics plant. Like everything, all of your work, all of your expertise, all of the skills that you learned were put in the service of the community, were put in the service of the development of the country. It was quite fascinating. Education under Chavez was for the creation of what he called a multipolar world. For Chavez, education either meant two things: giving life support to capitalism's profit orientation in such a way as to bolster the remains of the welfare state, or education meant recreating a socialism for the 21st century. Chavez was not concerned with incorporating the oppressed within the liberal democratic framework, but rather in changing the framework through the reorganization of political space through education. That is, through making the state function in a non-stable mode by reorganizing the state from the bottom up through the education and initiatives of the popular majority. Socialism, Chavez understood, could only be sustained by the subjective investment of those involved in the process. Now, of course, this was very different than, say, the philosophy of John Holloway or the Zapatistas in Mexico, who felt that you needed to change the world without taking power in the creation of autonomous communities. So the Zapatistas had a very different idea than in Zapatistas of Mexico than, say, the Chavistas of Venezuela. The Chavistas of Venezuela said, no, you cannot change the world without taking power. The Zapatistas said, you don't fight capitalism, you just refuse to reproduce it. But the Chavistas said, no, you need to take state power, but you can transform the state from the bottom up. So that's this kind of the main debate that I found in Latin America. You know, the kind of Zapatista notion, right? Of you make the road through walking, and the Chavista position that you can create the conditions of possibility to remake the state from the bottom up. Under Chavez, Venezuelan education was not only geared to help provide universal access to education, because Venezuela's poor had been shut out for generations. In particular, to those traditionally disadvantaged and or excluded groups, such as the urban poor and the rural poor, those of African descent and indigenous communities, but rather to help prepare the next generation of Venezuelans to enhance the conditions of possibility of a socialist alternative to capitalism. Venezuelan education aspired to be a combination of Frarian-influenced critical and popular education, where horizontal and dialogic relationships were pursued using holistic, integral and transdisciplinary pedagogies and methodologies based on principles for a liberating and emancipatory education. Under Chávez, of course, the Freire, Venezuelan Freire, was a man named Simón Rodríguez, who was the teacher of the great liberator, Simón Bolívar. Venezuelan education aspired to be a self-consciously politicized approach, which clearly directed itself towards an organic form of endogenous socialist development of the social community context as part of a larger struggle for a participatory, protagonistic democracy against the privatization of education and approaches hegemonized by the neoliberal education industry and its consumers' role grounded in egoism, competition, elitism, and alienation. Venezuelan education aspired to be humanistic, democratic, participatory, multi-ethnic, pluricultural, plurilingual, and intercultural. The development of a critical consciousness among the population was crucial, as was an integration of school, family, and community into the decision-making process. So that Venezuelan education favored a multidisciplinary approach to linking practice and theory, curriculum and pedagogy, with the purpose of creating social, economic, and political inclusion within a broader vision of endogenous and sustainable development, and with the larger goal of transforming a culture of economic dependency into a culture of community participation. This approach, for example, underwrote the courses at the Bolivarian University, where mentorship was provided to students who undertook projects in their local communities. Well, for instance, let me give you some examples. Community health students work with doctors within the Barrio Adentro Health Mission, and legal studies students, right? Students that were studying law, established a community legal center to advise and support families with civil law issues, while education students work with local schools with a teacher mentor. And in the evening, during classes at the UBV, the students discussed theory, linking back to and arising from their experiences in these projects. So they went out, all the programs went out in the communities, were involved in the communities. When they came back in the evenings to look at theory, right? Pedagogical theory, political theory, right? That's when that theory was discussed in the context of what was arising out of their own experiences working in these projects in the community. But of course there were obstacles to be overcome. How do you prevent the social formation of schooling to be integrated into the educational system without reducing education to the functional needs and requirements of the national economy? Big challenge. And further, how do you create an approach that addresses the political formation of students in a way that is not simply a formalistic and uncritical response to official ideologies that support socialist objectives? So that would be my challenge to them. Of course, this is not simply a challenge that faced Venezuelan education under Chavez, but this is a challenge of critical pedagogy in whatever context it's taken up and in whatever context it's engaged. Now, despite these challenges, it was really interesting because I remember President Chavez, the first thing Chavez said to me was, in Miraflores Palace, was, "Thank you for coming, Peter. Critical pedagogy is an important part of the revolution in Venezuela. Thank you for coming. Thank you for bringing your expertise to this country. Always remember, you're here to learn. As much as you are, share with us your expertise. You're here as a learner." And he absolutely proved to be correct. Under Chavez, education prospered. Over 93% of Venezuelans aged over 15 can read and write. The Venezuelan government has more than 90 institutions of higher education and remains committed to the idea that every citizen should be able to have a free education. Education was conceived within an integrationist, geopolitical conception of Latin American countries in a way that enabled Latin Americans to challenge economic dependency fostered on them by the imperialist powers, to resist colonialist globalization projects, and to create spaces where students could analyze critically local problems from a global perspective. So that under Chavez's leadership, the Venezuelan government invested significantly in all education levels. All social classes benefited from an increase in access to higher education. Chavez refused to follow the neoliberal strategy of finance-driven reforms, transferring fiscal and administrative responsibilities to either lower levels of government or to individual schools for cost-saving and efficiency purposes, thereby directly challenging the dictates of the Washington consensus policies. He refused a shift of the cost of education to the users through privatization, which would simultaneously instrumentalize participation as simply pecuniary and non-pecuniary household community contributions. Chavez's approach of municipalization refused to isolate universities from the rest of society and geographically deconcentrated the traditional university infrastructure and took the university to where the people are, to municipalities that have traditionally been underserved, as well as factories, as well as prisons, achieving what was known as territorial equilibrium. Territorial equilibrium. Harmonic development across the entire territory as the demographic, productive, and environment levels require. Now, just finish with Venezuela and have some concluding comments. But Hugo Chavez's demonization and ridicule in the Western press was lamentable, but understandable. Chavez took on President George Bush Jr., who he called Mr. Danger, and showed the world that a more humane world could be had through a democratic socialist alternative. For weeks following Chavez's untimely death on March the 5th, 2013, newspaper stories condemned his dictatorial brutality, thereby tarnishing the legacy of one of the world's most ardent visionaries of a world outside of capitalism. Hugo Rafael Chavez Frias rode the angel of history like a wild stallion across the fiery firmament of revolution, drawing back the curtain on imperialism's southern strategy and advancing the cause of the 20th century socialism. He was a soldier, in essence, one with sufficient humanity to stare directly into the heart of capitalism and warn us that capitalism pulsed with the leakages of sequestered oil and that its cap and trade compassion was market regulated. Hugo Chavez was crowned by history with a red beret and made us proud to be warriors for social justice, marching toward a new future. Now, we admit that some socialist organizations reject the idea that Hugo Chavez was a socialist. I happen to believe that they're wrong. By 2010, Chavez was asserting that as well as a Christian. He was also a Marxist, describing Marxism as the most advanced proposal toward the world that Christ came to announce more than 2,000 years ago. I actually heard him talk about Jesus and Trotsky in one speech, side by side. Very interesting. Chavez made it clear that he was not arguing for the reform of the Venezuelan capitalist state, but its overthrow. As he put it, in perhaps his most clearly articulated intention to destroy the existing state. And as quoted by Mike Cole here, we have to go beyond the local. We have to begin creating a kind of confederation, local, regional, and national, of communal councils. We have to head towards the creation of a communal state, and the old bourgeois state, which is still alive and kicking. This we have to progressively dismantle at the same time as we build up the communal state, the social state, the Bolivarian state, a state that is capable of carrying through a revolution. Now, I'm just going to sort of conclude. Well, what does this mean for socialism? What does this mean for the creation of a viable alternative to value production? This is, for me, a key question. Now, when labor is determined by necessity and external expediency ends, that is, when we exist outside the social universe of value production and are no longer defined by material production, in our tribulations as human beings, seeking to survive the world of vampire capitalism are no longer measured by labor time. Then, and only then, are we able to take the first real steps towards freedom. This is because production and consumption will be based on the totality of the individual's needs and capacities. Drawing our attention to Marx's storied phrase, from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs. But Peter Hudis, a Marxist humanist, corrects those who might interpret this phrase as some kind of quid pro quo. Here we need to understand that Marx is not saying that needs are met only to the extent that they correspond to the expression of a given set of abilities. This is the case because it would mean that human relations are still governed by material production. But the true realm of freedom lies beyond material production. Even when we move from socially necessary labor time to actual labor time, we're still outside of the realm of freedom. Entering the realm of freedom only occurs when actual labor time also ceases to serve as a standard measure, and labor serves as an end in itself, as part of an individual's self-activity and self-development. And as Hudis makes clear, free development for Marx could not be possible when human activity and products acquire an autonomous power and limits are externally imposed on the range by which individuals can express their natural and acquired talents and abilities. Marx went so far as to stress the elimination of the basis of both modern capitalism and statist socialist alternatives to value production. From the point of view of eco-pedagogy, the recentering on needs suggests an important reining in of unsustainable extractive practices. In the shift from consumption to the expression of natural and acquired talents lies the promise of better ecological stewardship. More specifically, a world society whose members subscribe to some kind of ecological discipline, as taught by eco-pedagogy, would shift from value production to sustainable participation in ecosystems. Joe Covell calls this activity ecocentric production. And as Hudis gives us something else to consider. He writes that the subjective development of the individual is, for Marx, a crucial precondition of a truly new society. In fact, for Marx, it was as significant as such objective factors as the development of the forces of production. Here he took the position that human subject activity could never be constrained by the forces of its own making. He went so far as to argue that it is not the means of production that create the new type of man, but rather it is the new human being that will create the means of production. That's something Che Guevara emphasized in Cuba. That was one of Che Guevara's messages. Marx understood that there was no way that progressive political forces would just somehow will a new society into being by a force of the imagination or by interlocking fingers with the capitalists in a toast to avoid the echo sins of the father. Any new society would have to come into existence imminently from the womb of the old society, with its specific conditions of capitalist production and reproduction and the forces in play that challenge such conditions. One of the promises of indigenous struggles within the current context, without romanticizing them, is the possibility that indigenous ways of being and knowing can be reimagined for a post-capitalist world. Big stress now in Latin America, a great respect for the socialist tradition of Europe, but a very strong commitment to move away from European answers for Latin America and to look at their own indigenous populations as a way of reimagining what a post-capitalist socialist world might look like. That is, from the existing struggles will come a new society, one that's both ecologically viable, partly because human needs are the focus and not endless consumption for an insatiable market. Well, why? Why, one might ask, did Marx not specify more about the time frame that societies could use as a reference for when they could expect to achieve certain steps in this progress towards freedom? Marx was cautious about getting ahead of what individuals could or could not achieve in the course of their practical history, precisely because he's wary of imposing any conceptions upon individuals that are... He advocated the rule of the proletariat, democratic, inclusive, and participatory communities of association. As such rule could work progressively to eliminate the social dominance of capital. While I do not claim the proletariat as the sole subject agent of revolutionary truth, the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat, as articulated by Marx, has much value for us today. In addition, decolonial thinkers such as Sandy Grande, Ramon Grosfoguel, Enrique Dussel, Walter McNolo, all of these has much value for us today. So that Marx stressed the development of the forces of production in part because he did not live to witness the most destructive power of the forces of production. Whereas today we are witnessing the need to limit the destructive power of many of these forces before they have overtaken us completely. Time is running out on the effort to save the planet from capitalism's vicious self-expansionary nature, and this is where the works by these new eco-pedagogy activists can provide us with a crucial intervention. Their work suggests links to existing work by Southern indigenous thinkers, insofar as it emphasizes a new worldview grounded in a recognition of human beings as being part of the land. And I just want to conclude here by telling you about one visit I had recently to Chirán in Michoacán, Mexico. It's a small mountain town, one of the 11 municipios that are officially devoted to the Purépecha Nation, indigenous group. I accompanied some educational activists from Morelia there to observe attempts by this community to break away from the Mexican state and to function as an autonomous community. You know, it's interesting, 800 illegal logging trucks were going in each day into the Purépecha lands and cutting down lumber and trees, protected by the narco-traffickers who were assassinating members of the Purépecha Nation. One aim of this autonomous movement was to form its own citizen militia to protect the surrounding forests from these illegal loggers. They were armed with automatic weapons that they had to use to protect themselves among the drug cartels. Here one could see that the casualty of capital's awkward brutality and unprecedented repression is not simply a relationship for export, but rather this kind of homegrown violence that permeates the unequal societies of the earth, sprouting in the soil of value production. Here, I could see the spirit of Paulo Freire at work in the attempts of the people to become self-governing. Here, Freire's entire pedagogical praxis stands for the God of the poor against both the egregiousness and good intentions of the God of the rich, the God of violence, or what we could call the God of unlimited progress. The fragrance from Freire's what I call his axiological theory, which holds the incense, right? It's not cassia, it's not sandalwood, it's not frankincense, it's not myrrh that we hear about in the Bible. Rather, it's the sacred sage of the indigenous peoples of Las Americas, signifying unwithholding love in Salvic graves. Here, Paulo Freire's face is hidden behind a signature Zapatista handkerchief. His pedagogy of liberation bent on creating the necessary, although insufficient, conditions of a world where the boulevards of the lonely and the despised will no longer be drenched with the tears from the poor mothers carrying pictures of their daughters, pictures of their sons, pictures of their husbands. In such moments of struggle, we act not from some divine fiat, but from our own compassion, from our love for our brothers and sisters and non-human animals, from our thirst for justice, and from our desire to end such needless suffering in the world. Yet the struggle will not be easy. On this path, we are threatened by our own human frailty, by those who would betray us and the principles of revolutionary comunalidad, by those who would use us as pawns for their own ends, and by the faux or fake revolutionaries who wish to be part of the struggle without sacrificing their own positions of power and privilege. It is these individuals who will take us down the paths of working in collaborative partnerships with statist institutions, all too eager to co-opt limited environmental resources, using what Richard Cohn calls a kind of public relations alchemy. But at the same time, there is another kind of imagining that is crucial to critical pedagogy. Eco-pedagogy carries with it the implicit, powerful lesson we need to talk about the future and to ignore those who tell us that normative considerations of utopian thinking are inappropriate for revolutionary critical pedagogy. We need to tell them they're wrong. This would be, in Marx's view, a self-refuting statement, as what will be is always inscribed within the what is. I got my last line here. We cannot have market freedom, hierarchical harmony, or authentic democracy within the social universe of capital. This monstrosity of monopolistic imperialist capitalism that is unable to distribute overproduction and unable to function even minimally without the extraction of surplus value. We must not be deceived. We must reject the liberal pluralism and methodological individualism as it only serves to bolster neoliberalism in the capitalist state. Our job on the left is to cobble together strategies and tactics from the debris of human suffering that surrounds us and that can unite us in a common cause, the kind of cause Dave Hill spoke of in his opening remarks. An eco-pedagogical approach that understands the ways of human suffering as part of ecocide will be a necessary part of this left strategy. Thank you.